We've been talking about externalities. In the last video illustrated the deadweight loss associated with the presence of a negative externality. So all of this is considered externalities that arise because of as an undesired byproduct of production or consumption activity. But another important type of externality arises with what we call common property. Now, common property is just a resource or a facility that's open to uncontrolled access. That is to say, everyone has free access. And unlike private property, for which the owner of that private property can exclude others from using their property, common property is not subject to such exclusion. An example might be an ocean fishery or an urban park where there's nothing to limit one's use of those resources. The issue is that since people do not have to pay to use the common property resources, they overuse those resources. This is sometimes called the tragedy of the commons. And pasture and grazing is a good example of that. Let's suppose that there's an open pasture that's owned by the government, that is to say it's Crown land, and the Crown hasn't put in place anything to restrict someone to have access to that land. And let's suppose that that land is surrounded by some sheep operations. What would be the natural thing to do for those producers of sheep is to actually allow their sheep to graze on that land as a way to try to increase the output from their animals without having to add more land to their own land base. Well, if all producers do this, what you're going to do is see eventually some overgrazing. And in fact, what will happen with overgrazing is that the pasture that was once available for grazing is no longer as productive as it once might be. So the fact that this resource is used by many people and it's overused leads to what we call the tragedy of the commons, in that the more people use a common property resource, the more they overuse it, and the less valuable that resource is to the broader society. Now, there's some other examples of common property examples. Roads, that is to say roads that aren't toll roads, are a good example of this. If you have a car, you have a property right to drive that car, but you don't have property rights to the highway. So you can't exclude others from driving, and in fact, you have to share the road with them. Them's the rules of the road. So competition for space on the highway will lead to congestion and longer travel times. That is a negative externality. Another example of some commons or common property problems include fisheries. A lot of fisheries have common access such that anyone can fish and no one has a property right to a fish until it's caught. Each fisher would then want to land a fish before others do, and those lack of clearly defined property rights leads to overfishing and in some cases overcrowding on particular waterways. And so what's going on here is that those fishers do not take into account the cost imposed on future generations by decreasing the stock of fish today. So someone's taking more fish today than they necessarily should, and what that does is it decreases the stock of fish today such that there's going to be fewer fish available in the future. Common pools are also examples of common properties. So a couple of sets of common pools include petroleum reserves in a country, water, other fluids and gases. So these are often extracted from common pools. That is to say that the petroleum reservoir is shared by a number of different extractors. Owners of wells drawing from a common pool compete with each other to remove that substance most rapidly, and that what ends up happening is that they gain ownership over those the materials they're extracting, but that also lowers the fluid pressure for other extractors from that common pool. The internet's also an example. Some of you might have internet access at home or high-speed internet access at home, and at particular times of the day you find that it gets very slow. It certainly happens on the university servers, and especially with CourseLink. Now what's going on here is that since many people have internet access that involves a fixed fee but no variable fees, or at least they don't experience variable fees until they use a significant amount of bandwidth, the marginal cost for that extra unit is essentially zero for many people. And so what that does is it leads to excess use, leading to congestion and gridlock and a slowing down of internet access. Now, we see these commons problems in all sorts of different circumstances, and so you might think about, well, if there's such a problem, are there solutions to these problems? And in fact, there are. One is government regulation of the commons. So for instance, sometimes governments charge taxes or an entrance fee to force each person to internalize the externality of them using that common access or that common property to some degree. So examples of this might be a toll on a bridge or a toll on a road. We often see that here, we do see that here in Ontario with Highway 407, or entrance fees to national and or provincial parks. We also see restricted access by governments to some common property. So there are some national parks and provincial parks where you get served on a first come, first served basis. And if you don't get access to that park, then too bad, so sad, you're out of luck. And so that's just a way to try to ration the access to that common problem, to try to limit the tragedy of the commons. Another way is to try to assign private property rights, or to at least assign property rights. So the idea here is that you convert open access property to private property, and that removes the incentive to overuse it. A good example of this happened in England in the 15 and 1600s, where you saw enclosure of common agricultural land on land barons' properties, and the granting of property rights to the serfs that were working for those land barons, where those serfs had rights to a particular enclosed area. So what we've seen is that a competitive market produces too much when a byproduct creates a negative externality, or when anyone can use a common property. So if we have an externality tied to production, the competitive market tends to result in too much production, and hence too much of the negative externality, or too much pollution. By the same token, through a competitive market process, or in fact with a lack of property rights, when anyone uses common property, we'll tend to see overuse. We also see this with respect to positive externalities. So a competitive market may produce too little of a good in the presence of a positive externality. A good example of that might be farmland located near an urban area. The external benefits associated with that farmland might include wildlife habitat and scenic values that people in the urban area value, but for whom the farmer who owns that land doesn't benefit. The person who's enjoying that wildlife habitat or those scenic views doesn't necessarily go and pay the farmer for their efforts to make sure that there's a habitat and a value or a view that's worth seeing. Now, more broadly speaking than talking about externalities and property rights and common property is a notion of public goods. And in fact, what we've been talking about all ties into public goods. And so a public good is simply a commodity or a service whose consumption by one person does not preclude others from also consuming it. So for instance, in the case of a pollutant like a water pollutant, the public good might be clean water. My consumption of clean water doesn't necessarily preclude someone else from consuming clean water. Another public good might be having park areas where there's no restrictions on access, and my appreciation and use of that parkland may not necessarily preclude others from consuming it. Now, what's important here is that if you make a public good available to one person, it is automatically available to other people. So if you make it available for one, it's available for all. If you make it available for one, but some people can't have access to it, then you don't have a public good. And in fact, what we're going to see in a few minutes is that there's varying degrees between what we call private goods and what we call public goods. So a private good is a good that has the property that it's both rival and excludable in consumption. Now these are important concepts in economics, so let's define them. Rivalry means only one person can consume the good. That is to say, the good is used up in consumption. It's depletable. So for instance, something that might be rival could be food. When I eat food, that food is gone. It's depletable. No one else can consume it. Exclusion has to do with whether or not someone could be prevented from consuming the good. Now, exclusion can relate to physical goods, but it also relates to things like public or common property, and also things like pollution and clean water and clean air. And in fact, when we combine rivalry with excludability, we find that there's 4 different types of goods. So in this table, we've got 2 rows. One row shows goods that are rival in consumption, and one shows goods that are non-rival in consumption. We also have 2 columns, one for goods that can be excluded, and one's for goods that cannot be excluded. If we have a good that is excludable and rival in consumption, then we have a pure private good. These are goods that you might go out and buy and use yourself, and yet you can prevent others from using, such as food or a pencil. On the other end of the spectrum, we have goods that are non-rival in consumption and non-excludable in consumption. These are pure public goods. Examples of this include things like national defense, lighthouses, clean air, and environmental quality. And so the idea here is that my consumption of national defense services doesn't affect other people's consumption of national defense services, and through the provision of national defense through a federal government, we can't exclude one person or another. If national defense were to be privatized, that private firm that's in charge of national defense might actually change the nature of that good from a pure public good to a good that's non-rival but is excludable. When we have goods that are non-rivalable and excludable, we call those public goods. An example of that might be cable TV or a club good. So a club good is a good where you pay for access to a resource and then you can use however much of it as you want. Toll roads are a good example of this, where you can exclude people from it on the basis of charging them a high fee, but once someone's paid that fee to get access to it, then that good is non-rival. A concert's another good example of that. We also have goods that are rival in consumption but non-excludable, and these are not common access resources. These are things like fisheries, or hunting resources, where once someone takes a particular good out of the marketplace or out of the sphere in which it exists, such as catching a fish or shooting a duck or shooting a deer, you then consume that good, and so that good is rival, but it's not excludable, provided that people are following the law and have hunting licenses. So we see different examples of these types of good all over the place. The thing that's important is to recognize that there's some very gray scales here, ranging from a pure private good on one end of the spectrum to a pure public good on the other end of the spectrum. And so a pure public good produces a positive externality, and excluding anyone from it is inefficient. So for instance, with the example of national defense, the cost of producing one extra person is about zero. There's no rivalry. And no one in the country can be left unprotected. And so we know in that case that it's going to end up being a pure public good. And as I said, many goods differ in the degree to which they have rivalry and excludability. A textbook is often viewed as a private good, but the information in it is a public good. And so I can buy a textbook and I can own that textbook. That's mine. That makes it a private good. And my consumption of it and ownership of it creates a dimension where I can exclude others from consuming it, but the information in that textbook is often a public good in that it's in the public domain and considered as a common property. This is a good place to stop. We'll pick up with further discussion of public goods and the consequences of externalities on the next video.